We are watching America quite closely. Yes, you are right that the numbers are rising there as well. But if you look at the countries that we have highlighted, one concern we have in UK, in Switzerland, in Japan, it's not just that the numbers, it's not just about the numbers that they have reported. In the case of the UK, it is rising very rapidly, but it's not just about the numbers, but the fact that these countries have abandoned any attempt at containing the spread of the virus. They have said so publicly, especially the UK and Switzerland, perhaps less so for Japan, but certainly in the case of UK and Switzerland, they have, I think the UK has been most public in acknowledging that there's no point containing, and they are simply now at the phase of trying to delay the spread. So if there is no deliberate effort to contain, then we anticipate that the numbers of infected cases in these countries will rise even more sharply in the coming days or weeks, and that's why we are quite concerned. The US has just put in place quite stringent border control measures for incoming travelers from Europe. I think they are starting to ramp up some of their measures, and including testing. So we are watching America, and like I said, this is a dynamic situation. Every few days we get more information about the status in different countries. So we may put in new countries in the list, or we may adjust countries with respect to where they are in these three buckets or three categories which I just described. Second question was on when is the peak in Singapore? No one, this is a question I ask our experts all the time, right? And frankly, no one can give a definitive answer at this stage. If you look at the epidemic curve, or if you look at, just data on number of new cases, it's quite interesting because you will see a rise in the first, just when the start of this epidemic, you'll see that it rose up, and then that's because of China, it's come down, and then now you see another wave of new cases going up, and it's largely cases outside of China. Some of these cases are still at an early stage of the epidemic curve. They are nowhere near the peak that China was before. Right? So, and there are many more countries now. Previously, China, one country, and China took very stringent containment measures to contain the virus within China itself and to limit the spread of the virus outside of China. You are now seeing the next wave of infection around the world, and as I said, the worrying thing is many countries, some of these countries, have already given up on containment. And they are quite prepared, as you heard some of these countries say, they are quite prepared for the virus to spread to a large proportion of their populations. So if they have given up on containment and they are allowing the virus to just spread, then the number of cases and the next peak that comes may well be higher than what we had faced in the initial wave when the virus was just from one epidemic center. Now we are facing multiple epidemic centers, countries which are not even thinking about containing the virus, and so we may be well facing a much higher number of cases outside of Singapore, exposure to more cases. And that's why we are quite concerned that Singapore will indeed be exposed to a new wave of infection which is potentially larger than what we had seen previously. And if that's the case, we do need more stringent border control measures in order to limit the number of imported.
When the world is faced with a crisis, leaders come together. The platforms vary, from the United Nations to the SCO to the OIC, the G7, the G20, different groups where leaders find solutions and pin responsibility. The wrongdoers are called out, sometimes even punished. But none of it is happening right now. It seems the Wuhan coronavirus has infected these world bodies too. They meet, but they achieve little. The Chinese virus has exposed their credibility crisis. The wrong sides are being allowed to say the right things. You're right, I'm talking about China, the global exporter of a crisis. Given a platform to expound on what the world should be doing. We now have official details of who said what at the G20 summit yesterday, and the accounts are extremely underwhelming, disappointing even. Tonight on Beyond Edit, we ask why the world's 20 most powerful leaders failed to hold China accountable. They're all suffering, but why must they suffer in silence? And we shall focus on one leader in particular, Donald Trump. He made the most unfortunate of U-turns. This is the same man who once crossed out Corona from his notes and replaced it with Chinese in black ink. Trump insisted on calling it the Chinese virus.
He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this?
Because it comes from China.
Racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
All the bluster was gone yesterday. The US president has now struck a conciliatory tone with China. Not only did he not put any questions to the Chinese leader, he had a late-night call with Xi Jinping. What happened there, you may ask? A quote-unquote very good conversation. Donald Trump now says they're working very closely because according to Trump, China has developed a strong understanding of the virus. How exactly? The answer probably lies in Xi Jinping's statement at the G20 summit yesterday. Let me quote some excerpts in order of the disbelief they invoke. The COVID-19 outbreak caught us all by surprise. China has acted with openness and transparency. We have put up a strenuous struggle and made tremendous sacrifices. We need to support the WHO in leading global efforts. China will increase its supply of anti-epidemic tools to the international market, and we need to cut tariffs, remove barriers, and facilitate the flow of trade. This is Xi Jinping at the G20 summit. Let me paraphrase it for you. We suffered, but we are fine now. You support the WHO while we sell you equipment and, by the way, drop the tariffs. That's what China told the world yesterday. What did the world say? Cheers. Read the G20 joint statement if you do not believe me. China's lines were appreciated by all. What does this tell you? That China's financial might is holding hostage the world's political will. The G20 was an opportunity to hold the Chinese regime accountable, not for us to hear how it has made sacrifices, because it hasn't. Not for its people, and definitely not for the rest of the world. G20 member nations did not even dare to politely suggest how China ought to change its policies so that deadly viruses do not spread like this in future. Let me tell you the price they'll have to pay for not being tough on China. 25 million global job losses. For our viewers in the United States, most of them will be in your country. 3.3 million Americans have already filed claims for unemployment. This was last week. Economists fear that the unemployment rate in America could reach 13%, 1-3, in about a month from now. What this means is that nearly a third of American workers are at risk of losing their jobs by May. For our viewers in Germany, 3 million people could be out of work if the crisis is allowed to get more severe. A report in the Labour Market Research Institute says that Germany's economic output is expected to shrink by 2% this year. And for our viewers in India, 120 million migrant labourers are seeing their wages disappear. Many cannot afford rent or food in cities with transport systems shut down. What are they doing? They're walking hundreds of miles to return to their villages. This could soon explode into a bigger crisis. The Federation of Indian Tourism Associations estimates that millions of jobs could be lost in the hospitality sector. The G20 member nations should look at these figures. After all, these countries represent 85% of global GDP. They need to break away with tired policies that have already brought devastation on the world. This pandemic is not a blind force of nature. It is not independent of human errors. The Wuhan coronavirus crisis is inherently political. It is a failure of governance. In this case, it is Chinese governance that has failed. And it is China that needs to be held accountable.
I'm not afraid if in a few weeks people call me an alarmist or if they say we overreacted, because if in a few weeks this turns out to have been an overreaction, it means we all did the right thing. And no one in my life has ever called me an alarmist before. I am trained to be cool in an emergency. In fact, I think of myself as someone who thrives in a crisis. But this is different. And I think myself and a lot of doctors across the country are scared to go to work in a way that we've never been scared before.
Wow, it's really hard to hear you say that. Because there you are, and you heard your colleagues in Northern Ireland put out their PSA, essentially, because people don't seem to be paying attention to this advice to stay home. It's really very difficult to get them to do that in the democratic world, it seems. But your Surgeon General in the US says this week is going to get bad. You heard your own mayor say there may be enough for a week, maybe more, of equipment to protect yourself and to treat people. What are you seeing where you are right now?
We are running critically low on PPE, or personal protective equipment, specifically masks and the safest kind of masks. Today, I've been given one mask to wear for all of my procedures and all of my operations for the day. And these are typically masks that I would dispose of in between every procedure. And we're expecting to need double the amount of masks that we're already using by next week. And we're already using an enormous number. And our masks are our only armor when we walk into the room of a COVID positive patient. It's the only thing potentially between us and getting sick from the disease. So it's a really alarming, critical shortage. Our hospital leadership is working tirelessly to solve this problem and get more PPE for our healthcare workforce. But we need everyone in the country to rally around this crisis and help us look for creative solutions to our equipment shortage.
So doctor, and I really hate saying this because you are one of these people who are at risk, but you've seen in Spain, you've seen in Italy, you've seen elsewhere reports that your tribe, your group of lifesavers are at very great risk of death. And yet you keep coming in. Do you think that you're going to make a difference, that actually the government is going to step up and do what it has to do? Your own governor has called for various industries to be nationalized, to make masks, ventilators, all the other things. He's called out the Army Corps of Engineers to transform the Javits Center in New York and other places as emergency, 1,000-bed wards and fever clinics.
The coronavirus outbreak might have slowed China down. But they're not giving up on their expansionist agenda. Chinese warships have been spotted around Taiwan. Even during a pandemic, Beijing is flexing its military muscle. This report explores.
200 kilometers from the southern coast of China is an island which has managed to contain the coronavirus outbreak. The world knows it as Taiwan, but for Beijing, this island nation is its province. They call it the Republic of China. For years, the sovereignty dispute has persisted, but economic ties with China have thrived. Now, as anger rises in Taiwan against the WHO and China's negligence, Beijing is flexing its military muscle to intimidate Taiwan. Chinese warships and fighter jets have been buzzing around the island. The president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen herself, has raised alarm about China's military maneuvers. In a detailed Facebook post, Tsai Ing-wen has called out China for its incursions and misplaced priorities during this pandemic. And in response to such provocations, the Taiwanese government has scrambled its own fighter jets. As the two sides trade barbs and fly jets, the United States has deployed a warship to the Strait of Taiwan. The USS McCampbell missile destroyer sailed through the Taiwan Strait on Thursday morning, claiming to be on a routine mission. A move which could further escalate tensions. because China views any passage through the Taiwan Strait as a breach of its sovereignty. How will China respond? It's hard to say. What we can say for sure is that the world can do without a military escalation in the middle of a pandemic. Viewer report, WION. World is one.
And if not, how many deaths are acceptable?
Yeah. How many? None. Okay. How many deaths are acceptable to me? None. Okay, none. If that's your question.
Dr. Ashish Shah, who's the head of Harvard's Global Health Institute, says that the key to getting this economy open as soon as possible is to test everyone who needs testing so we can quarantine all infected individuals and allow everyone else to go back to work immediately. Would you subscribe to that strategy?
No, but we have tested more than anybody. I saw him.
And if not, how many deaths are acceptable?
Yeah. How many? None. Okay. How many deaths are acceptable to me? None. Okay, none, if that's your question. Look, I saw him. I saw his statement. We have tested by far more than anybody. We're testing more than anybody right now. There's nobody even close. And our tests are the best tests. They're the most accurate tests. But if you're saying we're going to test 350 million people, I watched his statement. I disagree with it. We can go to certain states. I could name them now, but I'm not going to do that. But we can go to certain states right now that have virtually no problem or a very small problem. We don't have to test the entire state in the Middle West or wherever they may be. We don't have to test the entire state. I think it's ridiculous. We don't have to do it. A lot of those states could go back right now, and they probably will. We have some big problems, but it's confined to certain areas, high-density areas. So why would we test the entire nation, 350 people? With that being said, I'm going to say it again. We tested far more than anybody else.
This is a graph of the unemployment rate throughout modern history. Here is the average unemployment rate at about 4.5%. Here is the unemployment rate after the dot-com bubble burst and 9/11. That was at about 6%. Here is the unemployment rate during the financial crisis of 2008. That was at a whopping 10%. And here is what Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said could happen to the unemployment rate at some time this year. It is reported that the Senate and US lawmakers were warned of a 20% unemployment rate that could be coming in the near future. This would be the highest unemployment rate since the worst parts of the Great Depression. And if you don't believe that this is going to happen, well, we are already seeing signs that it is. Unemployment websites for the state of Ohio, New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. have all crashed this week. And in Ohio specifically, they received 36,645 unemployment claims just on Monday alone. That is typically what they would receive during an entire month. And the results were similar in Pennsylvania, where 50,000 people made unemployment claims, and Minnesota had 31,000 claims. And in fact, if that wasn't enough, the American Hotel and Lodging Association has already reported that 4 million jobs in the travel-related industries have already been lost in the last month, or are on the verge of being lost in the next few weeks, unless there is some drastic change to the current economic situation. Now, if that's true, that would almost double the current unemployment rate by itself. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, we're also seeing reports that nearly 50% of all hotels in the United States could face closures by the end of this year. And this is all being backed up by several respected economic institutes that have reported that it's likely 3 to 4 million jobs will be lost in the next several months in the United States, which would be on pace with the worst months of the Great Depression. So the economic trajectory of the global economy might be the worst it has ever been in history. And to prevent this, governments all around the world have been firing off every possible economic policy that they can in order to create economic stability, and thus far, well, nothing has worked. For example, when the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates to 0%, the very next day was one of the worst trading days in the history of the stock market. Another example is that the United States government announced an $850 billion stimulus package to the economy, yet the next day the market cratered another 9%. And finally, the big banks have received $2 trillion worth of loans from the Federal Reserve in the last 7 days in an attempt to help stabilize the market. Yet market volume volatility actually increased and is at a higher level than it was during the financial crisis of 2008. Now, taking into account everything that has happened to the economy over the past few weeks, we have seen roughly $25 to $40 trillion worth of losses since February. Think about that for a second. $40 trillion has just vanished, and this is not even being talked about by most people. It seems that every day we are waking up to trillion-dollar losses in the economy, yet no one is mentioning the potential repercussions that this will bring to the lives of the average person. And some of these repercussions might actually be quite surprising. Let me explain. You see, during the Great Depression, worldwide GDP fell by more than 15%, unemployment shot up over 20%, and global production of virtually everything fell by more than 50%. And because of this, the world, well, became poor. All of a sudden, a family that was living paycheck to paycheck in the middle class, they were now struggling to be able to even purchase food. You saw many other people losing their jobs and their life savings, which caused a doubling of the suicide rate during this period. And you also saw infants and children weighing significantly less than normal, which caused some long-term negative health effects, such as much higher blood glucose levels and a much higher risk of obesity by about 50% when these children grew up. Overall, the quality of life for the average person around the world dropped off a cliff during this time. But there was a strange thing that happened. Despite all of the negative consequences that came with the horrible economy, life expectancy and overall health actually increased. Here's why. What happens when the economy tanks? Well, people become poor, and when this happens, people need to make different choices with their money. So what you saw during the Great Depression was a reduction in smoking, a reduction in overall obesity, a reduction in traffic accidents, and there was also a significant improvement in overall air quality due to the lack of industrial activity. And as you might have heard, we've actually seen a reduction in pollution all around the world due to all of the lockdowns that are occurring. Now, all of these factors during the Great Depression actually led to slightly better overall health for the average person, despite the quality of life being significantly lower than it was before. They kind of lived by the motto, use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. That was a very common phrase back then. Now, after saying all of this, there have been more recent conflicting studies about health effects during a recession. For example, several studies have found that the 2008 financial crisis may have resulted in the deaths of several 100,000 people. This is because during that time, wealth for the average person and funding for health programs all dried up, therefore causing people to not get the care that they needed. But the main repercussion that I think of when considering this economic downturn is the impact it will have on the daily life of the average person. I mean, most people in the world are already living paycheck to paycheck and only have a few $1,000s worth of savings. And that can only get people so far. Now imagine what's going to happen if all of a sudden they are either laid off, have to take a pay cut, or have reduced hours at work. This is going to be the scenario for many people out there that are already struggling to get by, and unfortunately their struggle might only get worse really soon. Now, another thing that we typically see during times of economic hardship is something that some of you might find to be an oxymoron, and that is government efficiency. During economic downturns, we see near lightning speed of passing of bills and reforms that typically would take years to go through. In the 1930s, we saw the New Deal get implemented in just 3 months. And I mean, right now, President Trump is pushing for a temporary universal basic income policy where all Americans will be receiving $1,000 a month until the lockdowns are lifted. And think about that. That was considered an extreme left-wing policy up until just a few weeks ago. But when there's enough fear in the eyes of both the public and politicians, you typically see a lot of unification and agreement on drastic changes in policy. And so that brings up a few key points I want to touch on. Where is this influx of public money coming from, and where is the vanishing money going? So let's tackle the first question. The ability for the US government to pump in over $1 trillion worth of economic stimulus does not come from tax dollars. Well, not yet. You see, the government is actually taking out debt in order to give money to the public right now, in hopes that in better economic times, taxes will be raised so the government can pay back this debt. In a sense, the US government is borrowing money from the present-day American investors and financial institutions in hopes of paying them back in the future. So this means that even though your tax dollars today may not be going towards the economic stimulus package, it does mean that a small portion of all of your tax bills for years to come will go towards paying back this debt from the stimulus package. So all in all, the government is trying to limit the bad times today at the cost of limiting the good times of tomorrow. Now let's tackle the second question. Where is the vanishing money going? I mean, I mentioned how trillions of dollars are being wiped out daily, but what does this actually mean? Well, it's actually due to two factors. The first of which is that there is a lack of production due to the lockdowns. So for example, let's say you're back in medieval times and you have a small piece of steel that is worth around $30 to the market. But through your own productivity and skill skill set, you are able to turn this useless piece of steel into a much more useful sword. Now, even though the material is the exact same as it was before, you have now created a more valuable item that might be worth $200 instead of just $30. And that example is being applied all around the world today. Many people are in lockdowns and aren't able to utilize their normal productivity, which is creating less value to the overall economy. Secondly, there's something called crowd psychology. You see, the value of anything is solely based on, well, psychology. This can range from objects like cars or TVs to services like cleaning or haircutting, all the way to currency like the American dollar. Back in the day, an American dollar was backed by gold, meaning that you could convert your money into a proportional amount of gold. But after the abandonment of the gold standard in 1971, the American dollar's value was solely based on what the world thought the American dollar was worth. So if the entire population woke up tomorrow and thought the American dollar was worthless, then the American dollar would actually be worthless. Now think of what this means for the current stock market crash. Why is Apple worth $230 billion less today than it was a few weeks ago? Is it because they lost $230 billion worth of Apple products? Or had $230 billion stolen from their corporate bank accounts? Nope. It is because of crowd psychology, and indirectly supply and demand. A large reason why the price of Apple and the value of the entire stock market has dropped is because most people are scared to invest in stocks right now, and rightfully so. In a time of uncertainty in the economy, people would rather hold on to their money and not lose it, while trying to avoid investing in a company where it may go down 20% in just a few weeks. And this is how trillions of dollars are vanishing from the economy right now. The lockdowns are causing decrease in overall economic value and productivity, and that is being combined with the fear of economic uncertainty. And the trouble is, all of this creates a positive feedback loop. If everyone were to hold on to their money in perpetuity, then the economy would not work. By holding on to your money and not spending it at the local restaurant that you're used to shopping at, you are causing that local business to lose money and potentially go out of business. This causes the loss of more jobs and creates more fear about the economy, which causes more people to hold on to their money. This cycle continues until we hit a bottom like the recession that we are about to go through. And I do realize that the main reason that people are not going out to restaurants right now is because of the lockdown itself. That is the cause. But the effect that this has is still the very same. You know, it's very weird thinking about all this, about how trillions of dollars could just disappear simply because of productivity and psychological factors. But this is the world we're living in. And one of the last things I want to leave you with is what might happen to the average person and the economy going forward. The first thing is that there is a chance that you will lose your job this year. If you work in a service industry or a travel-related industry, you will likely be affected the most. But if you work in something like the tech industry, you will probably have a good amount of insulation from this recession. But regardless of what your situation is, just be prepared and don't be stupid with your money. Now, another thing I want to mention is that we are going through an unprecedented slowdown in the global economy. In fact, this is arguably the fastest drop in history. But what this also means is that we might also see one of the quickest rebounds in history. I mean, think about it. The main cause for this recession is worldwide lockdowns where people, well, just can't work. So if all of those lockdowns were to be lifted in the next few weeks or maybe a couple months, then theoretically we can see a pretty quick rebound from this recession. Now, I just would like to say that the rebound will not be anywhere near as fast as the fall, because it takes months or even years for new businesses to open up again, but it only takes a few weeks for businesses to go bankrupt, which is what we're seeing today, unfortunately.
For 30 years, I've been warning people in my books and in every other way I can that this world is controlled by a cult. It's a cult that has no borders. It operates in all the, at least major countries, and in fact, all the countries in the end, and particularly in those countries that dictate the direction of the world. So the cult will be at the core of the system in China. It will be at the core of the system in America, etc., etc., etc. And so what have I said in this 30 years that this cult wants? I've said, and I've said it in the chats we've had before, it wants to create a beyond Orwellian global state in which a tiny few people dictate to everyone else. I've referred to this as the Hunger Games society. And you can picture the structure very clearly. Picture a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, you've got a tiny few enormously wealthy people that actually are connected to this cult. We now have a name for them. We call them the 1%. At the bottom of this pyramid in the Hunger Games Society is basically the rest of humanity that is dependent upon the 1%. And in between the two is a vicious, merciless police military state to impose the will of the 1% on the population and to prevent the population challenging the 1%. And this Hunger Games society is not classic fascism, it's not classic communism, although the outcome in terms of tyranny is the same. It is a technocracy. Use the unquestioning, pathetic mainstream media to tell the public the version of the problem you want them to believe. And you're looking at stage 2, the reaction, for fear, that's the currency of control, outrage, whatever the problem is, and either a demand from the public that something must be done, or at least an acceptance from the public that things need to change because of the problem. Where this world is being taken by this cult, then everything seems random. Coronavirus, random. Climate change, random. Economic crash, random. Let's take all of that and apply it to the coronavirus and what's happening now, and let people decide for themselves if they think that the fact that the coronavirus hysteria ticks every single box of that outcome, that goal, whether that's a coincidence. I absolutely do not believe that it is. And in fact, we'll get into this as we chat, two massive 1% organizations, one in fact 6 weeks before this virus came to light in China, were playing out scenarios and simulations based on exactly this scenario that's unfolding now. And what they said would happen is exactly what is happening, down to the fine detail.
Okay, but the coronavirus is real and it is dangerous. You do believe that?
Well, not as a black and white, no.
Okay, but it is real?
Obviously, there is a strain of this coronavirus, because there are many coronaviruses, which appears to be different. But if you look in terms of the danger is to a certain section of society. 80% of people that are diagnosed with coronavirus have, and this is his quote, very mild symptoms. The ones that are in danger, and by the way, in danger from any virus, including the classic flu, are those that have compromised immune systems. And they are old people, elderly people, and they are people with what is termed pre-existing health problems. Why? The pre-existing health problems are putting so much pressure on the immune system, it's already weak when it's hit with this. This is why someone like that will have potentially a serious situation, and someone with an immune system in working order of any level will just swat it away. In 2017, 2018, 45 million people got the flu in America, according to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention figures. 61,000 died. Where was the hysteria then? 61,000 people died.
Well, they say that this is more dangerous and more contagious, and it's potentially going to kill more people. Because
well,
otherwise, that's a good question, David. Everyone's like, well, how come people aren't worried about this when the flu from 18 killed 50,000? This has only killed 8,000.
The point is, though, this is the point, that according to officialdom, 80% of people that get the coronavirus, diagnose the coronavirus, and not necessarily all got it, have very mild symptoms. The vast majority of the rest have what they call moderate symptoms, and that leaves some with compromised and weakened immune systems who get the serious end of it. And they get the serious end of the flu as well, and other virus. And so this coronavirus hysteria gives the excuse to do what they're doing, and the outcome and the consequences of what they're doing is to dismantle the world economic system. What this coronavirus hysteria is creating is a situation unfolding by the hour worldwide that is destroying small business, family business, even medium-sized business, some even relatively big businesses too. It's destroying them. The big legacy of what is happening now will not be to do with health long term, it will be economic. What happens to those people whose businesses collapse? What happens to all those people who were working for those businesses? For bars, for hotels, for all these businesses that have been targeted, don't go there, shut down. What happens to them? They fall into the bottom of the Hunger Games society. And as this virus came out of China, of all the countries in all the world, Iran got its smack worse than anyone before it started to appear in Italy. So not only did Iran have this, what again seems a stronger strain of it, but it was killing the people within the regime at a very early stage. And you know, that's a coincidence. How many coincidences do you want? Bill Gates, the guy that wants to vaccinate the frickin' world, and by the way, is funding the electronic tracking of people so that the authorities know if they've been vaccinated or not through an organization he funds called Gavi. And they ran this simulation called Event 201, in which they inserted, you know, scenario or simulated news reports. And if you watch them, you can see it on the internet. It's just like the news reports we're seeing in the media. And another possibility is that World Military Games was a wonderful front to release some kind of virus in that same area. So all these things are something that have to be explored and put into the mix, because what happens if you only believe the official version of everything is the official solution for the problem you believe in is going to take us further and further down the road to a society that would make George Orwell bloody wince. And all the things that I've said, this cult wants, this cult is getting as a result of this coronavirus. If they carried on and allowed that to happen, the world economic system would not be demolished. And the idea is to demolish it so you can replace it. Problem, reaction, solution. That's why.